Thank you. Carl has the hard copies. If you would like a hard copy, raise your hand. We'll always have a few of those available, and we'll get that out to you. Lamentations, written by Jeremiah after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, 585, depending on what dating system you're looking at there. Jerusalem is in just ruins. The temple has been destroyed. The last king of Judah, Zedekiah, had tried to escape. He was apprehended by the Babylonians. His sons were slain in front of his eyes, and his eyes were put out, and Zedekiah was led off into captivity. And at this time, Jeremiah writes that Judah has gone into exile under affliction and under harsh servitude. She dwells among the nations, but she has found no rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her in the midst of distress. Of course, at this time, when warfare broke out between two peoples, it was most times cast as warfare between the gods. And so the Babylonian king could say that his god Marduk was stronger than Jehovah God. Well, that's where Jeremiah also comes in and says, no, this is not the case. This is not a matter of another nation's gods being stronger than our God. Rather, this is a case of our God has afflicted us. The Lord has rejected His altar. He has abandoned His sanctuary. And speaking again of Judah, her adversaries have become her masters, her enemies prosper, for the Lord has caused her grief because of the multitude of her transgressions. Now, we don't have time to go into all the covenantal history between God and His people, but you go all the way back to Exodus 19, and when God has called Israel out of Egypt, and He brought them to Mount Sinai, and there at Mount Sinai He's going to give them the law, but He's also going to enter into a covenant with them. But the first thing He says to Israel is a covenant promise. You've seen how I have, rescued you out of Egypt. I've borne you on eagle's wings. And so He says to them, if you'll keep my commandments, I will be your God, and you'll be my people. And you read those blessings and curses found in Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy chapter 28. And what we see in this time period we're looking at is the culmination of those curses. That here is a people that has abandoned their God, they have abandoned the covenant, and they're going to suffer because of it. So we're looking at the period of the divided kingdom. The period of the divided kingdom starts with the death of Solomon, and we date that at about 931 BC. And it concludes with the destruction of Jerusalem, again in about 586 BC. So we're looking at a few hundred years of Old Testament history here. We're going to look at what happens with the various kings in this time period. We're going to look at what happens with God's people in general. We're going to look at God's messengers, the prophets, and seeing how those various prophecies fit in and what God was trying to tell to the people. And of course, we'll also seek to make some application from all this into our lives as well. But this morning, we want to look at, to begin with, if you didn't know, we're studying the divided kingdom. Why? Why did this kingdom divide? And we're going to look at a few reasons. And the first one that I want to look at, and probably spend a little bit more time on this one than any other, is this matter of this was somewhat of a divided people all along. Where do these tribes come from? Why do we have the 12 tribes of Israel? Okay, descendants of Jacob. All right, so let's think all the way back to the story of Jacob. And I think even there we see that there were always going to be divisions. So Jacob has 12 sons, but by how many wives? Or if you wanted to be snarky with me this morning, say, well, 2 wives and 2 concubines. Thank you for not being snarky. So he had 4 wives. The first one he wanted to marry, of course, was Rachel, but he was given Leah. And so if you recall, Leah has 4 sons, Anybody from my 16 periods class want to step up to the plate here? All right, so who are the first four sons of Jacob? Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Okay? That's when Rachel said, okay, I've got to have a son too, and if I can't, here, so take my handmaiden Bilhah. So we've gone Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali. Leah says the same thing. Well, here's my handmaiden Zilpah, Gad, Asher. And then Leah has two more, Issachar and Zebulun. And then finally Rachel has a son, Joseph, and then another son at her death of Benjamin. Now you also think back though, so we've already got division in the family. You know, this question comes up quite often. In fact, we talked about it a little bit in my class last quarter. You had this matter of, you know, there's supposed to be one man, one woman in marriage, and yet you have these Old Testament stories where these men of God have multiple wives. And God doesn't necessarily say anything about it. My point is, well, you look at every one of those examples in the Old Testament, and you will not find a harmonious family. Things are not well in Jacob's family. He has multiple wives, and there's a lot of division. And of course, we think about the rest of the story of Jacob's sons. Do you see division there? What do we read about Joseph? Hey, Dad, I had these dreams. And, you know, the sheaves of grain, all my brother's sheaves of grain are bowing down to my sheaf of grain. And the stars are bowing down to me. Well, we know how that made Joseph's brothers feel. But there's also other, even when we have the nation, we have the tribes, we see, particularly in the book of Judges, where these tribal divisions kind of came to the fore. Also look at this, and this is not a very good geographical map. It just has the tribes, but you can kind of see, just on this map, there's always going to be some division. So, for instance, we have on the eastern shore of the Jordan River, Manasseh, or half a tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. Well, we've got separation there. We've got a river separating us. I have a quote in the material about the Valley of Jezreel. Valley of Jezreel, if you look on your map, Valley of Jezreel is kind of running along that northern border of Manasseh, going through Zebulun and Issachar there. Well, that is one of the greatest areas in all of Palestine. One of the most fertile areas in all of Palestine. Who controls it during the time of the Judges? Not Israel most of the time. It's generally Canaanites. And so you've even got this matter of the northern tribes of Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, and Naphtali are somewhat separated geographically from their southern kinsmen. So you've got these divisions. Okay? But also during the time of the Judges, all right, Gideon, he goes to war against the Midianites. Judges chapter 6 and verse 35 says that he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they were called together to follow him, and he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet him. So here are the forces, and you see, again, geographically, he's calling the tribes, these northern tribes together, and who complains about that? Ephraim. Gideon defeats the Midianites, or God defeats the Midianites, and then Ephraim takes Gideon to task. Why did you not call us? And Gideon soothes him by saying, well, you know, all these kings have fled into your territory. You're going to get the honor of destroying these Midianite kings. But that's not the last time. In the days of Jephthah, the judge. Jephthah is referred to as the Gileadite. Generally thought that this is the idea is he's from the tribe of Gad, so on that eastern shore of the Jordan River. He goes to battle with the forces of Ammon. And again, the Ephraimites are upset. Why didn't you call us to war? And this time, Jephthah gathers all the forces of Gad. They go to battle with the Ephraimites, and this is where that story is that the Gileadites, they hold the fords of the Jordan River, and he gives them the task of, okay, someone comes to you and that they say that they're not from Ephraim, you give them a test. Have them say Shibboleth. And depending on how they pronounce it, you'll know if they're from Ephraim or not. But again, you see, these are not harmonious tribes. Ephraim is very concerned with Ephraimite honor. What do you mean you went to war with Ammon? You didn't call us. All right, let's go now to the United Kingdom. Who's my first king over all the 12 tribes of Israel? Saul. Saul is from which tribe? Benjamin. Saul is from Benjamin, which, by the way, takes us back to yet another Old Testament story, one of those horrific Old Testament stories that led to 25,000 Benjamites being killed. Killed by whom? The rest of the tribes of Israel. Israel went to war against Benjamin. And so it's interesting that the first king over all the 12 tribes of Israel, he is from Benjamin. Okay, well, we know Saul, he departs from the ways of God. And so what does God say? I'm going to choose another. I'm going to anoint another. And of course, that other one is David from the tribe of Judah. Okay? And we know the story. You know, David's going to spend most of the rest of Saul's reign on the run as Saul is trying to kill David. Saul dies. And all 12 tribes of Israel rush to make David king, correct? No. Which tribe makes David king? Judah. Judah goes to Hebron. They make David king. All the other tribes are following Ishbosheth, the son of Saul. And so for 7 years, you've got civil war between Judah and the other tribes until finally, with quite a bit of intrigue thrown in, David becomes king over all 12 tribes. All right, for the most part, these 12 tribes come together under David. There's great military campaigns that David brings about. And so the people fight. They fight for David, and they're very successful up until the time of Absalom. And when Absalom rebels, and there's some thought, even though the text doesn't really make this clear, there's some thought that Absalom is actually appealing to these tribal divisions. But Absalom rebels. David is on his way out of Jerusalem. And you see those tribal conflicts come to bear again. A man by the name, let me find his name again here. All right, this is how I pronounce it. I know it's not correct. Shimei? Probably not correct. Anyway, he's from the family of Saul, and what's he doing as David flees Jerusalem? He's cursing David. Saying basically, you are getting what you deserve for the demise of my family. Now we might say, well, that's more of a family, rivalry. Not really a tribal. But then you look after David's successful campaign against the forces of Absalom. Absalom was slain in battle. And you begin to read about how the tribes of Israel are vying with each other for the right to bring David back across the Jordan River to Jerusalem. Anybody want to take a guess which tribe is successful in coming to the fore to bring David back to Jerusalem? Judah, his home tribe. And so a man named Sheba, now guess what tribe he's from? Benjamin. He says to the rest of the tribes, we have no part in the house of David. Israel, back to your tents. So we're all in rebellion again, and so yet another rebellion has to be put down. So once again, these tribal conflicts are coming to the fore. Well, I think we see the worst case of this under the administration of Solomon. Solomon, like David, there's a lot of success. There's some times of harmony and prosperity, and so all the tribes are doing well. But in 1 Kings chapter 4, you read about how the kingdom was divided to provide for Solomon's table, provide for his house. And so he has 12 administrators over 12 districts. Each district is responsible for 1 month to provide for Solomon's house. Now, on the left side of the screen up there, you have the tribal boundaries as given in the days of Joshua. Here are, as best we can tell, the districts under the reign of Solomon. Which tribe didn't have a month? Judah. Judah is not having to provide for the house of Solomon 1 month. All the other tribes are. Judah is exempt. When we get to the division of the kingdom in our next lesson, kind of makes sense that 10 tribes say, we're done with Solomon's family. We'll make our own king. Judah, however, is fine staying under Solomon because they've had it better than everybody else. So there are these divisions that I think are kind of present in a lot of Israelite history, and they really come to the fore when we get to the days after Solomon. Any questions or comments on any of that? All right, let's now go back in our Old Testament. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 17. So we're looking again, why did the kingdom divide? Well, we had tribal divisions, and so these roots of division are always there. Now we're going to look at leadership failure. All right, so Deuteronomy chapter 17, given by God even before Israel takes the promised land. And yet God knows what's going to happen in the future, and He knows what His people are going to want. So He says, beginning in verse 14, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. So again, here is God. He says, there's going to come a day where you want a king. I know this. So here are the criteria. When this happens, he has to be one of your own countrymen. You cannot set up a foreigner over you. But then he gives some more specific stipulations as to what this king is supposed to be. All right? Cannot multiply horses. Now, is God just against, horses? Why would a king wish to multiply horses? And why would he go to Egypt for horses? Well, in that time, what's the horse for you as you're a king? Not, you can get to ride them and, go for nice jaunts in the woods, but it's the weapon of war. This is your military might. Egypt, remember, when Egypt pursued Israel, Israel's on foot. What's Egypt in? They're in chariots. They're being drawn by horses. Egypt has, great military might because they have a lot of horses too. So God says, don't go back to Egypt. I brought you out of there. I don't want you going back there. But specifically, you're not going back there and gathering a lot of horses. You're not going to rely on your military might. Okay? Wives. Now, yes, I think we probably have an illusion here too that God's will is not that a man would marry a bunch of wives. But for a king, why would a king be tempted to marry a bunch of wives? Alliance. You can ally yourself with all kinds of countries. Marry the daughter of this king and you'll be in an alliance with that country. So God's saying He's not going to put His trust in what military alliances He can make. And of course, don't multiply gold and silver because, don't rely on your riches. Solomon, wisest man on earth, And yet at some point, Solomon turns away from God's wisdom and begins to look at man's wisdom. Because guess what? Solomon did every last one of those things. Solomon, according to 1 Kings chapter 10, and in verse 26, text reads, Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And it goes on to talk about specifically how he went to Egypt and gathered horses. Now we know from 1 Kings chapter 11 about Solomon's many wives. It's interesting though, when it talks about Solomon's first wife in 1 Kings chapter 3, whose daughter was she? Pharaoh's daughter. 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 1, the first wife we read of for Solomon, she's Pharaoh's daughter. And of course, you read 1 Kings chapter 11, and all of his wives and all of their gods, well, yes, he has entered into all these alliances with all these other kings, and they've all brought their various faith systems and religions and idolatry into the house of Solomon. And of course, Solomon was exceedingly wealthy. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 14, the weight of gold which came into Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. And it goes on to talk about the wealth of Solomon there. Now, go back again to Deuteronomy chapter 17. So after God has said he cannot multiply all these things for himself. That's not what my king is about. He then goes on to say in verse 18, it shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, and he may learn to fear the Lord his God. So again, the idea here, don't put your trust in military, alliances, wealth. Know my law, put your trust in me. But you continue on. By carefully observing all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, and he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or the left. What kind of king did God say Israel was supposed to have in relationship to the people? One who served the people. And in fact, when you look at Solomon, when God first spoke to Solomon and had Solomon choose, what one thing that he would wish God would do for him, and Solomon chooses wisdom, why did Solomon say, I need wisdom? So I can judge your people. That request was made out of this ideal of what the king's supposed to be. A king should serve the people. But God said, when the king starts doing these things, his heart's going to be lifted above the people. And that was absolutely the case of the king of Israel in the waning days of Solomon's reign and the beginning of Rehoboam's reign. He was no longer a servant of the people. He was no longer interested so much in the welfare of the people as his own status and power. So you have poor leadership. Oh, well, see, you ought to always go over your slides before you get up here. Then you'll remember, yeah, we had all that. All right, we covered that. All right, now, this is the area, though, where God says, here's why this is happening, and it's covenant unfaithfulness. Now, we'll start with Solomon. Because God says to Solomon, this is going to happen, and it's because of your unfaithfulness. So look at 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11, and we'll start reading in verse 9. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord. Yes, exactly. They said that, so the Lord said to Samuel, they didn't reject you. They rejected me that I should be king over them. But then the Lord says, okay, you're going to go ahead. You're going to give them what they want. But first, you're going to explain to them the manner of this king. Now, anybody want to summarize what the manner of the king would be that God said through Samuel? You don't have to go into details. Just give me a general summary. Yes, Sister Catherine.
You're going to take your daughters and your wives. They're going to make them servants. They're going to give you to a Christian. You're going to get what you're asking for. It's not going to be free.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, he is going to, that's exactly right. He's going to be like the other kings. Other kings take what they want. They're going to take part of your family. They're going to take part of your land. They're going to do whatever they want to. That's how the king's going to be. Then I want you to notice what God says in verse 18. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. That definitely comes true following the death of Solomon. The people are crying out, we don't like this anymore. And then what does the Lord say? But the Lord will not answer you in that day. The kingdom divides because of covenant unfaithfulness. Yes, the covenant unfaithfulness of Solomon, but ultimately the covenant unfaithfulness of the entire people. Going back not just to the days of Samuel, but going back all the way to when God first led them out of Egypt. But in this case, God says, okay, you can have a king. Here's what he's going to be like. You're going to get tired of it. You're going to cry out. I'm not going to answer. And so the kingdom will divide. Well, one other reason, and this is something we're also going to do our best to kind of at least give a little bit of a picture of the geopolitics of the area. When you look at Israel on a map, you have to remember they are sandwiched between the dominant peoples of the ancient Near East. They've got Egypt to the south, and Egypt has relative periods of strength and weakness. Egypt was relatively weak during the days of Solomon. That changes, though. You've got the area of Mesopotamia to the north, the land between the rivers. The ancient kingdom of Babylon was there. And of course, for our study, the Assyrian Empire is going to radiate from there, and then the Babylonian Empire will radiate from there. You've got Syria just to the north of Israel, and they're going to become very strong before they are ultimately, supplanted by the Assyrians. So you've got Israel, who we can see in the days of David, when they're faithful, when they have a king who's faithful in following God, they can be mighty. But when they haven't been faithful, and when they don't have God fighting their battles, they're right between two powerful peoples. And those people are going to afflict them. You see that, go back to 1 Kings 11 again. You see that beginning even in the closing days of Solomon. All right, so you can pick up on it, but beginning in verse 14, the Lord raised up an adversary to Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was of the royal line in Edom. For it came about when David was in Edom, and Joab, the commander of the army, had gone up to bury the slain, and had struck down every male in Edom. For Joab and all Israel stayed there 6 months until he cut off every male in Edom, that Hadad fled to Egypt. That's going to be a central theme in this passage. Here's an Edomite. Edom's not strong. They're weak. They've been taken over during the days of David by Israel. But you have this Edomite, and he flees to Egypt. Well, what happens when Egypt begins to gain in strength? Well, Egypt is going to be all too happy to use other peoples surrounding Israel to afflict them. Now, let's ask this question. Why does Egypt care about what's happening in Israel? It's the same reason why most people care about what happens in the world today. Trade. The trade routes run through Israel. And if Egypt can control Israel, they can control trade. So that's why Egypt, and then later on these nations from Mesopotamia, they're going to always be looking at Israel with a greedy eye. We want that land. We want to control trade. Well, when the Egyptian Pharaoh becomes powerful, he wants to reassert his dominance in Israel. He wants to control the trade. So he is all too happy to harbor this fugitive from Edom. And so he continues on, verse 17, Hadad fled to Egypt, he and certain Edomites of his father's servant with him, while Hadad was a young boy. It then talks about a king in Midian, verse 19. Hadad found great favor before Pharaoh. So they gave him in marriage the sister of his own wife, the sister Taphnes the queen. But anyway, it goes on to talk about how ultimately Hadad is given help by the Egyptian Pharaoh to go back and to lead an insurrection against Solomon. Now there's one other figure that's going to flee to Egypt for sanctuary. Anybody know who that is? No, not Absalom. Jeroboam. Jeroboam, who is one of Solomon's officials, Jeroboam is going to rebel against Solomon. We'll talk more about that rebellion in a later lesson. Jeroboam rebels against Solomon. Solomon then is going to kill Jeroboam. Where does Jeroboam go? He goes to Egypt. And he stays there conveniently until after Solomon's death. And then guess who's there when the tribes all assemble at Shechem to tell Rehoboam, we're tired of this, we don't want this anymore. Jeroboam's right there. Egypt is playing a role. Egypt wants instability in Israel. And so, again, we're just going to try to do a little bit of keeping up with what's happening in these other nations to understand here's how God can bring all this about. And He can do it so very easily. Because Egypt's there, they're waiting. Assyria is going to be there, they're waiting. And God would protect His people if His people were faithful to their covenant. Well, very quickly, just a couple of takeaways even for us to consider from this. I find this idea of a people, and we tend to think of it as the people of Israel. There's plenty of indications in the Old Testament. That's not how they necessarily thought of themselves. But a lot of times it was tribe first, nation second. I'm of Ephraim. How dare you not call Ephraim to battle? I'm from Benjamin. How dare you supplant the king that came from Benjamin? What's Paul's greatest concern in his letters? Specifically the letters where he's thinking about the divisions that could easily happen between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians in the church. It's tribalism. He's so concerned by that. So that wonderful passage in Galatians chapter 3 where he says there's no Jew, there's no Greek, there's no slave, there's no free, there's no male, there's no female. You are all one in Christ. As many of you have been baptized, you're the descendants of Abraham. You are heirs according to the promise. This is what matters. To be a united people, we have to find identity in Christ. That's where it is. Real quickly. Another takeaway, you look at the leadership, and we'll see this just expounded upon throughout the rest of the study. Well, godly leaders are sacrificial leaders. Solomon started that way. He wanted to serve the people. He did not end that way. Jesus, the greatest leader of all, though, came not to be served, but to serve. He is the good shepherd who gives his life for the sheep. And he calls on us as we lead is sacrificial, is giving for others. And then finally, even looking at this idea of the nations that are surrounding Israel, we're definitely going to see this come to the forefront. Where's our security? Security belongs in the covenant. You want security? Be faithful to the covenant. And if we're faithful to the covenant, we have security. All right, you were very, very kind and gracious. I'll look forward to seeing you all back in class on Wednesday evening. Thank you.